The morning Clara Whitfield walked into the land office in Dusty Creek, Texas, with a price written on a scrap of paper that was barely enough to buy a season's worth of flour. Every man in that dusty room knew something had gone terribly wrong in her life, and not a single one of them moved to make it right. It was the spring of 1878, and the Texas Panhandle was still a land of contradictions, a place where fortunes were made and broken in the same afternoon, where the wind carried both the smell of wildflowers and the dust of broken promises. Dusty Creek itself was a town that had sprung up around a railroad stop, ambitious enough to have 2 saloons and a proper church, small enough that everyone knew whose horse was tied outside which establishment on a Saturday night. Clara had not been to town in 6 weeks. The last time she had come, it was to attend the funeral of her husband, Thomas Whitfield, a man who had worked 20 acres of good grazing land with the kind of stubborn love that only a true homesteader could understand. He had died of a fever in late February, the kind of sudden illness that swept through the territory without warning or mercy, taking men who had seemed as permanent as the hills. Clara had buried him under the old cottonwood at the north end of their property, said the words herself because the circuit preacher wouldn't arrive for another 2 weeks, and then gone back into the house and fed their 8-year-old daughter, me, and their 5-year-old son, Henry, because there was no one else to do it. 6 weeks later, she had reached the end of what she could hold together alone. The land office was run by a man named Silas Drum, a heavy-set fellow with a mustache that he waxed with something that smelled faintly of pine resin. He sat behind a long wooden counter covered in maps and ledgers, and he looked up at Clara the way men in positions of minor authority always looked at women who entered spaces they weren't expected to occupy, with a kind of tolerant impatience. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, not unkindly but not warmly either. "What can I do for you today?" Clara set the piece of paper on the counter. Her hands were steady. She had practiced keeping them steady in the wagon on the way into town, gripping the reins with both hands and staring at the horizon the way Thomas used to do when he was working something out in his mind. "I need to sell my property," she said. "The Whitfield homestead, 40 acres on the East Ridge, including the water rights to the creek tributary. I need to sell it quickly." Drum looked at the paper. His eyebrows rose just slightly, the kind of movement a man makes when he is trying not to show his reaction but fails anyway. "Mrs. Whitfield, this price here," he said, tapping the paper. "This is considerably below market value. The Whitfield land, I'd estimate that's worth somewhere in the range of $400, given the water rights alone." "I know what it's worth," Clara said quietly. "Then why, I have a bank note coming due in 3 weeks," she said. "Thomas borrowed against the land last fall to buy seed and livestock. If I don't pay, the bank takes everything. The house, the land, all of it. I get nothing." She paused. "If I sell now, even at this price, I can pay the note and have enough left to take my children somewhere and start again. I won't own the land, but I'll own my future." Drum looked at her for a long moment. He had the expression of a man who understood the arithmetic perfectly and found it deeply uncomfortable. "That's a hard situation, ma'am." "Yes," Clara agreed. "It is." She had worked out the numbers so many times that they had stopped feeling like numbers and started feeling like the walls of a very small room. The banknote was for $220. Thomas had borrowed it from Harlan Briggs at Dusty Creek Savings and Loan, a man whose patience for widows and orphans extended precisely as far as his ledger books required. Briggs had sent a letter 3 days after the funeral expressing his condolences and confirming that the note would still come due on April the 14th, regardless of circumstances. The letter had been polite. The message inside it had not been. Clara had considered every option with the methodical exhaustion of someone who has not slept properly in weeks. She could try to farm the land herself, but without a hand to help her and with 2 young children underfoot, She would not have enough to sell by harvest to cover the note plus interest. She could try to find a hired hand, but that required money she didn't have. She could ask her nearest neighbor, old Walt Prout, for a loan, but Walt was barely keeping his own place together since his wife had passed. She could write to her sister in Missouri, but her sister had her own family and her own debts, and the letter would take 3 weeks to arrive and another 3 weeks to get a reply. And by then it would be April the 15th and none of it would matter. Selling the land at a loss was the only thing she could control, so she was controlling it. Drum agreed to post the listing that same day. Clara thanked him and walked back out into the sharp morning sunlight of Dusty Creek's Main Street, where she stood for a moment with her eyes closed and her face tilted up toward the sky, just breathing, because sometimes breathing was the bravest thing a person could do. She did not see the man who had been standing at the window of the general store across the street, watching her through the glass. His name was Rafe Calloway, and he had arrived in Dusty Creek 4 days ago with a horse, a bedroll, a saddlebag of supplies, and a reputation that had preceded him from 3 counties over, though he himself would have been uncomfortable knowing that. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered in the way of men who have done real physical labor all their lives, with dark hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck where it had grown too long, and a face that was handsome in the way that honest, weathered faces sometimes are, not because of any particular beauty, but because there was something in the arrangement of the features that suggested a man who meant what he said. Rafe had come to the Panhandle looking for land. He had spent the last 7 years working cattle drives up from San Antonio, saving methodically, living simply, turning down the kind of opportunities that required a man to look the other way. He had enough now, just barely enough, to buy something modest. A piece of grazing land, maybe a small house, the beginning of something permanent after years of impermanence. He had walked into the general store that morning for coffee beans and cornmeal, and he had ended up standing at the window watching a woman he didn't know walk out of the land office across the street with her chin lifted and her back straight and her hands clenched at her sides. And something in the way she carried herself, that particular combination of dignity and barely contained heartbreak, had stopped him in his tracks. He was still standing there when Silas Drum came out of the land office and tacked a listing to the board beside the door. Rafe bought his coffee beans and his cornmeal, walked across the street and read the listing. He read it twice. Then he walked into the land office and asked Silas Drum to tell him everything about the Whitfield property. Drum, who was nothing if not a thorough professional, obliged him. The land was good quality, east-facing, with enough shelter from the winter winds to make it viable for both grazing and small-scale farming. The water rights to the creek tributary were legitimately valuable, the kind of thing larger ranches were always trying to acquire. The house was solid, built by Thomas Whitfield himself with limestone block, which meant it would stand for a generation. The outbuildings were in reasonable repair. The livestock, 3 horses and 11 head of cattle were included in the listing. And the asking price, Rafe said carefully, "Is this correct?" Drum cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitfield set the price herself. She has a bank note coming due." Rafe looked at the listing for a long moment. A man with straightforward intentions would have said thank you, taken the deal, and considered himself lucky. The land was worth easily 3 times what she was asking, with the water rights possibly 4 times. In the boom-and-bust economy of the Panhandle in 1878, with ranchers expanding their holdings and the railroad pushing access further west every year, that land would only increase in value. He said, "Who holds the note?" "Harlan Briggs at the Savings and Loan, $220 due April 14th. Rafe looked at the calendar on Drum's wall. It was April the 2nd. He had 12 days. "I'll take the property," Rafe said. "At the listed price. Draw up the papers." Drum, to his credit, looked briefly troubled. "Mr. Calloway, I want to be clear that Mrs. Whitfield understands she is selling below. understand what she's selling it for," Rafe said. "I'd like you to draw up the papers." He also asked Drum one other question before he left, and the answer to that question sent him directly to the savings and loan, where he had a conversation with Harlan Briggs that was brisk, businesslike, and from Briggs's perspective, entirely satisfactory. $220 changed hands. The note was paid off and a receipt was issued. Then Rafe rode out to the Whitfield homestead to introduce himself. He found the place without much difficulty, following Drum's directions east along the ridge road, until the limestone house appeared on the crest of a gentle hill, surrounded by the kind of practical, unornamented yard that spoke of people who had too much work to do to spend time on ornament. There was a kitchen garden beginning to show green along the south wall, a clothesline with children's shirts hanging in the wind, a barn that leaned slightly to the left but had been propped with new timber recently, the wood still pale against the weathered gray of the original boards. He saw the children first. The boy, Henry, was sitting on the porch steps doing something with a length of rope, and the girl, Me, was at the far end of the yard tossing grain to a small collection of chickens. Neither of them paid Rafe much attention, the way children don't pay attention to things they haven't been told to worry about yet. Clara came out of the house before he'd even dismounted, because she had heard the sound of hoofbeats, and in 6 weeks of being alone, she had learned to come to the door quickly. She stood on the porch with a dish towel over her shoulder and a look on her face that was composed and watchful and not at all welcoming, because she had learned that too. She was 29 years old, and the 6 weeks since Thomas's death had left marks on her that anyone paying attention could see, shadows under her gray eyes, a thinness in her face that hadn't been there before, a particular stillness that wasn't calm but was instead the stillness of someone who has burned through all their other responses and arrived at simple endurance. But she was also, undeniably, a woman with a quality that the word beautiful doesn't quite capture, something more durable than beauty, something in the bones of her face and the way she held herself that suggested she had been forged rather than simply grown. "Good afternoon," Rafe said, removing his hat. "My name is Rafe Calloway. I spoke this morning with Mr. Drum at the land office." Clara looked at him steadily. "You're here about the land?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then you'd better come in." The inside of the house was exactly what the outside suggested, the home of people who had built something real and kept it carefully. The main room had a stone fireplace, a table with 4 chairs, a shelf of books that included a Bible, a farmer's almanac, and what appeared to be a novel of some kind, and a braided rug on the floor in shades of blue and rust that someone had made with considerable care. It smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of something baked that morning. Clara gestured to the table. They sat across from each other, which felt oddly formal, and Clara set a coffee cup in front of him without asking if he wanted one, which he appreciated. "Mr. Drum told you the situation," she said. "It was not quite a question." "He told me about the note and the deadline, yes," Rafe said. "Mrs. Whitfield, want to be straightforward with you. I'm a working cowhand, been driving cattle 7 years out of San Antonio. I've saved enough to buy land and I intend to settle. I read your listing this morning and I went to Mr. Drum and I agreed to purchase at your listed price." Clara nodded once. She had been expecting this or something like it. "When would you want to take possession?" "I want to pay you today," Rafe said, "so you can go to the bank and settle the note before it comes due. Can stay at the boarding house in town until you've made arrangements to relocate." Something in Clara's expression shifted just slightly, not softening exactly, but becoming more specific, more present. She had been dealing with the transaction as an abstraction, and suddenly it was not abstract anymore. It was this man at her table, offering to let her leave her home in a manner that preserved her dignity, and the kindness of that was almost worse than the unkindness would have been. She looked at her coffee cup. "That's very considerate of you. You're selling well below what this land is worth," Rafe said carefully, I'm aware of that. Want you to know I'm aware of it. I know what it's worth, Clara said, the same words she had said to Drum, but with a different edge to them now. I've known every inch of this land for 3 years. Thomas and I came out here from Tennessee when me was 5. We built that barn together, he and I, in August, and it was so hot I thought we might both die from it. She stopped. I'm not telling you that to make you feel guilty. Just want you to know it was a real place. To me, I mean. Understand, Rafe said quietly. She looked up at him then, a direct, evaluating look that was not unfriendly but was clearly the look of a woman who had learned to assess things quickly. You're not from around here. No, ma'am. I've been working the trail up from San Antonio. I'm looking to settle. Alone. Yes, she nodded, as though that answered something she hadn't quite asked. All right, Mr. Calloway. I'll accept your offer. The papers were signed the following morning at Drum's office. Clara received the purchase price in cash, which she immediately carried down the street to Harlan Briggs at the Savings and Loan. The satisfaction of watching Briggs's expression as she laid out the payment, the slight deflation of a man who had expected to acquire the land through foreclosure and was instead receiving merely what he was owed, was one of the very few uncomplicated pleasures she had allowed herself in 6 weeks. Briggs stamped the receipt. The note was cleared. Clara walked back out into the April sunlight with $2.30 remaining in her pocket, which was not enough to take her children anywhere, but which was at least hers. She sat down on the bench outside the general store, and she looked at those $2.30 in her palm, and she felt the full weight of what she had done. The house was not hers anymore. The garden she had planted was not hers. The grave under the cottonwood was not, legally speaking, hers, and that thought hit her in a place so deep and specific that she had to close her hand around the coins and press it against her knee and look very fixedly at a point across the street until the feeling passed. She was still sitting there when Rafe Calloway came out of the land office and stopped when he saw her. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read, and then he sat down on the bench beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them, and he didn't say anything for a minute, which she was grateful for. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and he took out a folded piece of paper and he set it on the bench between them. Clara looked at it without touching it. "What is that?" "Read it," he said. She picked it up and unfolded it. It was, she realized after a moment of confusion, a deed. The deed to the Whitfield homestead, 40 acres on the East Ridge, including the water rights to the creek tributary. The property she had sold him that morning. But it was made out in her name. She read it again to be certain. Clara Ruth Whitfield, sole owner, etc., etc., the language of ownership in the formal, slightly archaic phrasing of a legal document, but her name in it, clear and unambiguous. She looked up at him. "I don't understand." "Had Drum draw it up this morning before we signed the sale papers," Rafe said. "Right after came to see you yesterday, actually. Had the idea then. The sale goes through, you get the money to pay the note is clear, and then the land comes back to you." Clara stared at him. "You paid for land you immediately gave back." "Well," he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost embarrassed, "you needed the note paid off. The land is still worth having. Mr. Calloway," her voice was very careful, "you spent every dollar you had on this transaction." He was quiet for a moment. "Not quite every dollar. Kept enough for the boarding house through the end of the month." Clara looked at the deed in her hands. The paper was solid and real. Her name was on it. The land was hers, actually hers, free of the banknote that had been hanging over her like a boot about to drop for 6 weeks. She felt something shift inside her, something that was not quite grief and not quite relief and not quite gratitude, but was a mixture of all three in proportions she couldn't measure. "Why?" she asked. He seemed to consider this genuinely, as though he hadn't prepared an answer in advance. "Because it was your land," he said finally. "You built it, your husband is buried on it, your children grew up on it. It seemed wrong for it to go to someone else because of a bank note." That happens to people every day in this territory, Clara said. I know, Rafe said. I've seen it. He looked out at the street, where a wagon was passing with a family's entire household piled in the back, the kind of sight that in 1878 could mean anything from fresh arrival to hard departure. Seeing it doesn't make it right. Clara looked at him for a long time. She had a great deal of experience reading people, the kind of experience that comes from 3 years of farming in isolation where your nearest neighbor is 2 miles off, and you learn to assess a person quickly because you don't have time for the slow accumulation of evidence. She was reading him now, carefully, the same way she would have read the weather on a morning when she needed to make a decision about the day. What she found was a man who was telling the truth. She refolded the deed and held it in both hands in her lap. "Can't let you do this," she said. "You spent years saving that money." "I'm aware," he said mildly. "You have nowhere to live and no land and no money." "Not strictly true. Have enough for the boarding house through the end of the month. And I'm good with horses, I can get work." "Mr. Calloway Rafe," he said. "Please." She looked at him again. "Rafe." The name felt odd in her mouth the way new things do. "This is not a sensible thing you've done." "No," he agreed. "It probably isn't." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with something that neither of them was quite ready to name. The April sun was warm on the bench, and the street smelled of dust and horses and the faint sweetness of bread baking somewhere. A dog was barking somewhere down toward the livery stable. The ordinary world was going about its business without any particular regard for the extraordinary thing that had just happened. "You should at least come to supper," Clara said at last. "You paid for it, technically." Something shifted in his face, something that might have been a smile if it had been allowed to go further. "That would be very kind, ma'am." "Clara," she said, "since you've apparently decided to reorganize my life without being introduced." This time the smile did go further. It changed his whole face in a way that was, she noticed with some irritation, quite appealing. "Clara," he said, "I'll be there at 6 if that suits." It suited. She drove back to the homestead with the deed in her pocket and the slightly dazed feeling of someone who had walked into a situation expecting to lose and had instead come out with everything they came in with, plus the inexplicable kindness of a stranger to account for. She told me and Henry over lunch, choosing the version of the story that omitted the more complicated parts and emphasized the ones that were simple enough for a child to hold. A nice man had helped them keep the land. They didn't have to leave. The house was theirs. Henry received this information with the focused solemnity of a 5-year-old and then immediately went back to his rope project. Me, who was 8 and understood more than Clara sometimes remembered, looked at her mother with wide, serious eyes. "Is the nice man coming back?" Me asked. "He's coming for supper," Clara said. Me nodded as though this confirmed something she had already worked out on her own. "Good," she said. "We should make the biscuits." The biscuits were, by any objective standard, excellent. Clara had learned to make them from Thomas's mother on a visit to Tennessee before they moved west, and she had refined the recipe over 3 years of cooking on a wood stove at altitude, and they came out golden and layered and smelling of butter. And she put them on the table beside a pot of venison stew made from a deer that old Walt Prout had brought by 2 weeks ago along with a loaf of bread, and the particular awkward kindness that neighbors in the territory showed when someone had died. Rafe arrived exactly at 6, which told her something about him. He had changed his shirt, which told her something else. He brought a jar of honey from the general store for the children, which told her something she hadn't expected, and which made her heart do a small, involuntary thing that she chose not to examine. He was good with me and Henry in a natural, unperformed way, the way people are when they have actually been around children rather than simply tolerating them. He listened to Henry's solemn explanation of the rope project, which had evolved into something that Henry described as a lasso, but which was, Clara privately thought, more of an abstract expression of determination. He asked me what book was on the shelf that wasn't the Bible or the almanac, and when she told him it was Great Expectations by Mr. Dickens, he said that he had read that one twice and thought the ending was one of the best he'd ever come across. Me immediately wanted to know if he could read, and when he confirmed that he could, she disappeared and returned with a battered copy of Aesop's Fables and asked if he would please read The Tortoise and the Hare, and Rafe looked briefly at Clara, who nodded, and he read it with a quiet, steady voice that filled the room in a way that was comfortable rather than intrusive. Clara watched him read to her daughter and felt something she hadn't felt in 6 weeks, something she hadn't expected to feel for a very long time. Not grief, not exhaustion, not the relentless forward motion of pure survival. Something softer, something that scared her a little. They ate supper, the 4 of them around the table where 3 of them had eaten every meal for the past 6 weeks, and the conversation was the kind of careful, genuine conversation that people have when they are getting to know each other and finding more there than they expected. He told them about the cattle drives, about crossing the Red River with 150 head when it was running high, about the stars over the Ano Estacado on a clear night, about the particular smell of a campfire in the early morning before anyone else was awake. He asked about their life in Tennessee, and Clara found herself talking about it in a way she hadn't let herself. The mountains, the trees, the way the seasons were more clearly defined there, the way she had followed Thomas West because he had a dream the size of the Panhandle sky, and she had believed in it absolutely. She had not talked about Thomas with anyone since the funeral. She had been afraid that talking about him would dissolve the careful structure she had built around herself, but it didn't. It just felt like telling the truth. After supper, Rafe helped clear the table, which she hadn't expected, and she stood at the wash basin, and he stood beside her with a dish towel, and they washed and dried the supper dishes with the children running around in the background. And the domesticity of it was so unremarkable and so startling at the same time that Clara had to concentrate very hard on the dish in her hands to keep her expression neutral. When he left, he stood on the porch and said, "Thank you for supper, Clara. It was the best meal I've had in 7 years, and that's not an exaggeration." She looked at him in the last light of the evening, which was the particular amber gold light of the Texas Panhandle in April, the kind of light that makes everything look like something worth remembering. "Thank you for what you did today," she said. "Haven't found the right words for it yet, but thank you." He put his hat back on and stepped down off the porch. "I'll be in town," he said, "if you need anything." She watched him ride away down the ridge road, and she stood on the porch for a while after he was gone, listening to the night sounds coming up, the crickets beginning, the distant call of a nighthawk, and she felt the particular clarity that sometimes comes after a day that has changed things. She went inside and tucked me and Henry into their beds, and me, in the drowsy, candid way of children at the edge of sleep, said, "I like Mr. Calloway, Mama." "Go to sleep," Clara said and kissed her forehead. "He reads very well," me added. "He does," Clara agreed. She blew out the lamp and stood in the dark of the children's room for a moment, and then she went to bed herself. And for the first time in 6 weeks, she slept without waking in the middle of the night from the particular dream she had been having, the one where she was in the house, and it was no longer hers, and she couldn't find anywhere to put her hands. The next morning she went out to see if her garden had held up without her attention. It had mostly, with the stubborn vitality of things that are properly planted and left to do their work. She spent 2 hours weeding and staking and felt, at the end of it, something that took her a moment to identify as ordinary contentment. The feeling was so unusual that she stopped and stood with her hands dirty and the sun warm on her shoulders and thought, so that is still possible. She saw Rafe again 3 days later. Not by arrangement, but because Dusty Creek was a small town and the land office, the general store, the feed supply, and the one good water pump were all within 2 blocks of each other. And if you spent any time in town, you would eventually encounter everyone else who was spending time in town. He was coming out of the feed supply when she came out of the general store, and they both stopped at the same time, and she saw something in his face that she was beginning to recognize, a kind of careful attentiveness, the way a person looks when they are paying more attention than they want to let on. "How is the land looking?" he asked. "The creek's running well. The grazing grass is coming in early. Thomas used to say it was the best spring grazing in the territory." She paused. "He wasn't wrong." "He wasn't wrong," Rafe agreed, and his tone suggested he had been to see the land, which she realized she didn't mind. They walked together as far as the post office, where she was collecting the mail, and the conversation was easy and slightly careful in the way that conversations are when both people are aware of something underneath them that they haven't yet decided to surface. She had a letter from her sister in Missouri, which she hadn't written to since the funeral because she hadn't been sure what to say. She read it on the bench outside the post office. Her sister was concerned, kind, and entirely unable to help in any practical way, but the warmth of it was real, and Clara folded it and put it in her pocket and was glad she had a sister. Rafe was still nearby, attending to his horse, and he looked up when she came down the steps and said, "Everything all right?" "Letter from my sister," she said. "She worries." "That's what sisters do," he said. "I have two. They've been worrying about me since about 1865. "What happened in 1865? "I was 12, he said, "and I rode a horse that I had been explicitly told not to ride, and it threw me and I broke my arm in 2 places. They never quite recovered their trust in my judgment." Clara laughed. It was a short, surprised laugh, the kind that escapes before you've decided to let it, and the sound of it seemed to catch them both slightly off guard because it was the first time she had laughed in 6 weeks and they both somehow knew it. "Come for supper again Saturday," she said before she'd entirely decided to. His expression was warm and direct. "I'd like that very much." He came Saturday, and the Saturday after, and the one after that. May arrived, and the Panhandle greened up the way it sometimes did in good years, and the Whitfield homestead, which was once again indisputably Clara's, began to look less like a place holding its breath and more like a place that was deciding to go on. Rafe had found work, as he'd said he would, at the Hendricks Ranch 3 miles north of town, doing what he knew how to do, handling horses, mending fence, the ordinary hard work of keeping a ranch operating. He was paid fair wages and he was good at what he did, and the work suited him while he figured out what came next. He was honest with himself, or tried to be, about what he was doing on Saturday evenings. He was not going out to the Whitfield homestead to assess the grazing land. He was going because Clara Whitfield had gray eyes that went very still when she was thinking, and because Me had started saving up questions for him all week and presenting them in a list on Saturday evening, and because Henry had decided that Rafe was the appropriate person to teach him to properly throw a lasso, and because the house smelled of good cooking and the lamps burned warm in the windows, and it felt, in a way that nothing had felt in 7 years of campfires and bunkhouses, like a place where a person might want to stay. Clara was aware of all of this. She was a perceptive woman, and she was not in the habit of pretending not to notice things. She noticed that she thought about Saturday the other 6 days of the week. She noticed that she laughed more on those evenings than she had laughed in the entire preceding winter. She noticed that Rafe had quietly, without making any fuss about it, repaired the gate that had been sticking since October, and had looked at the leaning barn and said casually that with one good day's work it could be braced properly, and she had said equally casually that was probably true. And the following Saturday he had arrived with the right timber and the tools to do it, and they had spent the afternoon bracing the barn together, and at the end of it her hands were sore and there was sawdust in her hair, and she was happier than she'd been in months. She also noticed that Rafe was careful. He was careful with her in the specific, thoughtful way of a man who understands that he is in territory that requires care. He did not push or press. He did not make assumptions. He was simply, consistently, quietly present, and he paid attention, and after a while she began to understand that this was not restraint but respect, which was a different thing entirely and a better one. It was Walt Prout who said something first. This was not surprising. Walt was 72, had outlived 2 wives and a war, and had no remaining use for delicacy. He came by the homestead one Thursday afternoon in late May, ostensibly to return a borrowed fence tool, and found Clara mending a harness on the porch, and sat down in the other porch chair and smoked his pipe and looked at the view for a while and then said, "That Calloway fellow comes out here a good deal." "He does," Clara agreed, without looking up from the harness. "Good man," Walt said. "Hendricks says he's the best hand he's had in 10 years. Doesn't drink to excess. Doesn't start trouble. Paid off a widow's land note out of pure principle." He puffed the pipe. "That kind of man's hard to find." "I'm aware," Clara said. "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" Walt said. "Make what easy?" Walt looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has been 72 for long enough to have lost patience with indirection. "Clara, child, that man is in love with you. Has been since approximately April the 2nd, from what I can tell, and you are not unaffected." Clara set down the harness. She looked at the horizon for a moment, the long flat line of the Panhandle against the late afternoon sky, the kind of view that went on forever and made a person feel both very small and strangely clear-eyed. "Thomas has been gone 4 months," she said. "I know it," Walt said gently. "I'm not sure I'm ready." "Nobody ever is," Walt said. "Ready is something you decide, not something that happens to you." He knocked out the pipe against the porch rail. "Thomas was a good man and he loved you well. I don't think he'd want you to spend the next 40 years alone on this ridge." Clara was quiet for a long time. A hawk was circling something out in the grazing field, patient and inevitable. "He told me once," she said at last. "The year before he died, he said, 'If anything ever happens to me, you go on living, Clara.' He made me promise." Thought it was a strange thing to make a person promise, but he was serious about it. She paused. Thomas was rarely serious about anything that wasn't important. "Then maybe," Walt said, "you should let yourself keep the promise." She thought about it for 3 more days. She thought about it while she was feeding the livestock and tending the garden and reading to the children in the evenings. She thought about it in the early mornings when the light came in sideways through the east window and made the inside of the house look like something in a painting. She thought about Thomas, not with the acute, disorienting grief of the early weeks, but with the quieter, more permanent grief that was settling in as his absence became not a shock, but a fact of her life. She thought about who she was now and who she might be in 10 years, and what kind of life she wanted to build in this house on this land that was, astonishingly, still hers. The following Saturday evening after supper, after the children had gone to bed, they sat on the porch in the last of the evening light, which was the time they had fallen into the habit of sitting together and talking, or sometimes not talking, just being in the same space with the nighthawks calling overhead and the stars coming out one by one. Clara said, "Can I ask you something direct?" "Always," Rafe said. "When you gave the land back, did you know you'd be coming back? To see me, I mean." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that isn't evasion but consideration. "I knew it wasn't a business decision," he said finally. "I knew I was doing it because I couldn't bear for you to lose something you'd built. But I told myself it was just the right thing to do." He paused. "I don't think that was entirely honest." "No, no." He turned to look at her directly, and in the low evening light his face was serious in a way that she had come to understand meant he was saying something he meant completely. "I'd been around a long time looking for a place that felt like somewhere worth stopping. And I sat across from you at that table in the land office and I thought, I don't want to go somewhere that doesn't have this in it, that feeling." He stopped, as though looking for the right word. "That particular kind of realness." Clara looked at him for a long time. The nighthawk called twice and went quiet. Somewhere down the ridge, one of the horses moved in the corral. I made a promise to my husband, she said slowly, that I would go on living. That's a good promise, Rafe said. Think it's a good promise too, she said. I've been trying to figure out what it means. She looked out at the darkening sky. I think maybe it means not being afraid of things that might be good. The silence between them had changed quality, the way silences do when something has been said that shifts the air. He reached across and took her hand very gently, and she let him. And they sat like that in the growing dark with the stars spreading overhead in that particular panhandle profusion that always looked like something no painter could improve on. And Clara felt something settle in her, not the absence of grief, because grief was part of her now and always would be, but something alongside it, something that was warm and solid and possible. I'm not easy, she said after a while. I have opinions about most things and I express them, and I have 2 children who will argue philosophy with you at the breakfast table, the older one in particular. I know, he said. I've been coming to supper for 2 months, am familiar with your opinions and I find them, without exception, either correct or at least extremely interesting. She laughed, and this time she let the laugh go on as long as it wanted to, which was a generous amount of time. And I don't want to leave this land, she added. I'm not going anywhere. I don't want you to leave this land, he said. This land is yours, she looked at him. Where would you go? He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with a care that told her he was not speaking lightly, I was thinking the East 40 acres is good grazing land. The Hendricks place is short on hands. Could probably pick up grazing rights on a few of the open parcels east of the ridge. He paused. Could be useful here if you'd have me. You're asking to stay, she said. I'm asking to stay, he said. Clara looked at his hand over hers, their fingers intertwined in the dark, and she felt the full weight of the question and the full weight of the answer, and she let herself feel both of them clearly. Yes, she said, I'd have you. He didn't move or speak for a moment, and she could see in his profile something that was release, the particular expression of a man who has been carrying something carefully for a long time and has just been told he can put it down. He raised her hand and pressed it briefly to his lips, an old-fashioned gesture that nonetheless felt entirely genuine, and she thought Thomas would have liked him. It was not the strangest thought she had ever had, but it was one of the truest. They told the children the next morning. Me received the news with the gravity of someone who has already worked this out independently and is simply waiting for the adults to catch up. Henry wanted to know if Rafe was going to help him with the lasso, and when Rafe said yes, absolutely, that settled the matter for Henry. The practical arrangements took some working out, because practical arrangements always do when real life is being built rather than imagined. Rafe gave notice at the Hendricks ranch and moved his things out of the boarding house. He slept in the barn initially, because it was the right thing to do and because Clara said so, and because Rafe was, as Walt had observed, a man of genuine principle. They agreed that they would be engaged, and that they would marry when the summer was out, which gave them time to be certain of what they were certain of, and to let the children accustom themselves to the changes. The engagement was not a secret, partly because in a small town in the Texas Panhandle in 1878, nothing was a secret, and partly because neither of them was inclined to hide something that seemed to them simply right. Drum at the land office shook Rafe's hand and said he'd seen it coming. Walt Prout said good, about time. Harlan Briggs at the Savings and Loan maintained his customary expression of financial neutrality, which was the only expression he had. There was one difficulty that summer, and it came in the form of a man named Devlin, a rancher from the South who had heard about the Whitfield water rights before Clara had sold the property, and had, apparently, intended to make an offer of his own. He came out to the homestead in June, riding up the ridge road with a hired man beside him, and he was the kind of man who had spent a long time having his offers accepted and had mistaken this for the natural order of things. He offered Clara twice what she had sold the land for in April, which was still below market value but was meant to seem generous. Clara said politely that the land was not for sale. Devlin looked around the homestead with the assessing gaze of a man cataloging assets, let his eyes rest briefly on Rafe, who was fixing a section of fence nearby and watching the exchange with a particular quality of attention, and said that surely she had thought about the practical difficulties of maintaining this place on her own. Clara said that she was not on her own. Devlin looked at Rafe again, and something in his calculation shifted. He said he would make the offer again in the fall, in case circumstances had changed. Clara said that the land was not going to be for sale in the fall either. After Devlin had ridden away, Rafe came over from the fence line and stood beside Clara and watched the dust from their horses settle. He didn't say anything immediately. "He'll come back," Clara said. "Probably," Rafe said. "The water rights are valuable and he knows it." "He's not getting them," Clara said, with the particular flat certainty of a woman who has already lost enough. "No," Rafe agreed. "He isn't." Devlin did come back in August, and this time he brought his lawyer, a man from Amarillo who carried a leather case and spoke in the measured tones of someone who had been trained to make the unreasonable sound inevitable. He talked about the value of the land and the challenges of small homesteading, and the opportunity being presented to Mrs. Whitfield to secure her financial future. Clara listened to all of it. Then she said, "I'm going to be married in September. My husband and I intend to expand the grazing operation and develop the creek tributary. The land is not for sale at any price, and I would appreciate it if you would convey that to Mr. Devlin clearly and finally." The lawyer looked at Rafe, who had been sitting on the porch steps throughout this conversation with his arms resting on his knees and his hat pushed back, and who now met the lawyer's gaze with the kind of steady, unhurried calm that is more effective than any display of force. The lawyer packed his leather case and they left. Rafe looked at Clara. "September," he said. "Unless you have objections," she said. "No objections," he said. "September is a good month." They were married on the 14th of September, which was, not by complete coincidence, the date the banknote had originally been due. It seemed to Clara like a good reclamation of a date that had frightened her, and when she said as much to Rafe he agreed that it was exactly the right thing to do with a frightening date. The ceremony was held on the ridge, in the open air, in front of the house and the garden and the repaired barn, and the grazing field where the last of the summer grass was still green. The circuit preacher, a man named Alderman who smelled faintly of horses and read the Bible with a directness that Clara had always appreciated, officiated. Walt Prout was there, the only guest besides the children, though several of the Hendricks Ranch hands rode by at a respectful distance and removed their hats. Me served as a witness, standing very straight in the clean dress she had insisted on pressing herself, holding a bunch of wildflowers she had picked that morning, and taking her responsibilities with the complete seriousness of an 8-year-old, who understands that this is a significant occasion. Henry fell asleep during the ceremony. Rafe had predicted this would happen. Clara had not believed him. She would have admitted later that he had been right. The preacher asked Clara if she took this man, and she looked at Rafe in the September afternoon light and said yes, clearly and firmly, the way she said all things that she meant. The preacher asked Rafe if he took this woman, and he said yes in a voice that was quiet but absolutely certain. They were married. The preacher stayed for supper. Walt Prout cried a little and pretended he wasn't. Me ate 3 biscuits and declared the day a success. Henry woke up in time for dessert, which was a dried apple cake that Clara had made from a recipe Thomas's mother had given her, and which she had made on purpose because some things are worth carrying forward. The first winter of their marriage was a hard one. The Panhandle in 1878 and 1879 was not a forgiving landscape in the cold months, and the work of keeping the homestead viable through the winter required everything both of them had. There were days when the wind came down from the north with a ferocity that made the limestone house feel very small, and days when the snow covered the grazing land and they had to break ice in the water trough twice a day and carry feed to the livestock through drifts that reached the fences. They worked through all of it together, which was different from working through it alone, and the difference was not merely practical. There is a particular intimacy that comes from hard shared work, from being the two people who are responsible for the same thing and who show up for it every day regardless of the conditions. Clara and Rafe had that from the beginning, built into the foundation of what they were, and the winter cemented it in ways that summer and warmth couldn't have. They were also falling in love in the ordinary, daily way that is less like the lightning strike of romantic stories and more like the way a river carves a canyon, persistently, over time, making something permanent. She learned that he read voraciously, anything he could get his hands on, and that he had strong opinions about books which he expressed with the same quiet directness with which he expressed opinions about everything else. She learned that he could not carry a tune to save his life, but sang anyway under his breath, when he thought no one was listening, and that me had discovered this and found it hilarious, and that Rafe accepted her hilarity with good grace. She learned that he was slow to anger but absolutely implacable when he had decided something was right, and that this was the same quality whether it manifested as fixing a fence that didn't strictly need fixing yet or giving back a widow's land. It was just the same thing in different forms. He learned that she was, as she had warned him, opinionated, but that her opinions were always rooted in genuine thought rather than stubbornness, and that she was almost always right, which made the opinions easier to contend with. He learned that she had a quality of stillness at the center of her that had nothing to do with passivity, a deep rootedness that came from knowing who she was and what she was for, and that this quality, more than anything else, was what had drawn him across the street in April and kept him drawing back. He learned that she grieved for Thomas in her own private way, not hidden from him but not displayed either, and that her love for Thomas was part of her and not separate from her love for him, that she was a person whose capacity for love was not diminished by its previous use but enlarged by it. He understood this to be a gift and treated it accordingly. In the spring, Clara told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the early morning in the kitchen, while he was making coffee, and she was standing at the east window, watching the light come up over the grazing field, and she turned and said it in the same direct, clear way she said everything, without preamble or drama, just the facts stated plainly and her gray eyes watching his face. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her face in his hands with the care of someone holding something that matters more than anything, and he looked at her for a moment, and then he said, very quietly, "Are you all right?" She had been worried about what his first question would be, without quite knowing she was worried about it, and this was exactly the right one. "Yes," she said. "I'm very well, a little tired." She paused. "Happy?" she added, as though this needed confirmation. "Good," he said, "because I'm so happy I cannot find the words for it." She laughed and put her hands over his. "Then we won't use words, we'll just be happy about it." They were happy about it. The children were told at breakfast, and me asked very specific questions about the logistics of babies that Clara answered with the measured candor she believed children deserved. Henry considered the matter, and then said he hoped it was a boy because he needed someone to teach things to. The summer of 1879 passed with the particular golden quality of a time that is recognizably good while it is still happening. Rafe had negotiated the grazing rights on 2 parcels east of the ridge, as he had said he would, and with the additional acreage, the cattle operation had grown to the point where it was genuinely viable rather than merely surviving. The vegetable garden produced abundantly enough that Clara was able to trade surplus with the general store for goods they needed. The barn, properly braced, stood solid against the summer winds. Devlin did not come back. Whether this was because he had found other opportunities or because the message had been clearly received, neither of them knew or particularly cared. Walt Prout came for Sunday dinner every 2 or 3 weeks and was, in practice, as close to a grandfather as the children had, which suited everyone. He had known Thomas, and he spoke of him naturally and easily in a way that Clara valued, not as a ghost or a sacred absence, but as a real man who had lived and been part of this place, and was still, in the ways that mattered, part of it. Me started the school in Dusty Creek that fall, riding in with Rafe on his Monday through Friday supply runs and home again in the afternoon. And she had opinions about everything the teacher taught and also strong opinions about the teacher herself, most of which were favorable. She was reading Great Expectations on her own by October, which she announced at breakfast one morning as a statement of fact, and Rafe said he thought she was probably the only 9-year-old in Texas who could say that, and was probably right. The baby arrived in November, in the early hours of a cold morning when the frost was on the windows, delivered by the Dusty Creek midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Hadley, who had brought a considerable portion of the town into existence, and did so with the practiced efficiency of someone who was very good at her work. He was a boy, solid and loud, and furiously indignant about the fact of being born, with a head of dark hair that clearly came from Rafe, and a set of lungs that clearly came from nobody's side of the family but his own. They named him Thomas James Calloway, Thomas for the man who had built the house and loved Clara well and asked her to promise she would go on living. James for Rafe's father, a man he had not spoken about much but always with a particular quiet respect. Rafe held his son for the first time in the gray pre-dawn light of the homestead kitchen, where it was warm from the stove, with Clara resting in the next room and Mrs. Hadley drinking tea at the table and Henry asleep, and me pretending to be asleep, while actually watching everything from the doorway of the children's room. And he looked down at the baby in his arms and felt something that had no name he knew in English or any other language. The specific, staggering love of a parent holding their child for the first time. Me, who had given up pretending to sleep, came and stood beside him and looked at the baby with the expression of someone encountering a situation more complex than anticipated. "He's very red," she said. "They always are at first," Mrs. Hadley said. "He looks like he has opinions," me said. "He does," Rafe said. "He'll fit right in." Me considered this and then nodded and went back to bed, apparently satisfied. Clara recovered well. The winter passed with the baby growing and changing in the rapid, astonishing way of infants, and by Christmas little Thomas was focusing his eyes with great intensity on the candles Clara placed in the window, and on the patterns of firelight on the ceiling and on Rafe's face, which seemed to fascinate him especially, a fact that Rafe found disproportionately touching. Henry, who had wanted a boy to teach things to, threw himself into this project with considerable dedication, sitting beside the baby and explaining, at length, the principles of the lasso, which Clara thought was both premature and entirely consistent. Me read to the baby from Aesop's Fables, the same book Rafe had read from that first Saturday evening, and Clara, sitting nearby with her mending, listened to her daughter's clear, careful voice reading the old stories, and felt the specific, layered happiness of a life that is genuinely working. She thought about where she had been a year and a half ago, sitting on the bench outside the general store with $2.30 in her closed hand, and a deed she no longer owned and nowhere particular to go. She thought about the morning she had walked into the land office with that piece of paper and her hands steady and her back straight, and her heart doing what hearts do when they are breaking, which is keep beating anyway. She thought about Rafe coming across the street and reading the listing and going into the land office and doing the thing that had changed everything. She thought about how much had been given back to her, not just the land, but the life that went with it, larger than the one she had expected. One evening in the spring of 1880, when little Thomas was 6 months old and sitting upright with considerable assistance from his father's hands behind his back, and Henry was demonstrating his now genuinely impressive lasso technique in the yard, and me was on the porch, reading with her boots off and her feet folded up under her. Clara came and sat beside Rafe in the evening light and leaned against his shoulder and looked at her family on the land that was hers, that had always been hers and always would be. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" He said, "About April the 2nd, 1878. He was quiet for a moment, his hand moving gently against the baby's back. "What about it?" "I went into that land office thinking I was losing everything," she said. "Had made my peace with it, more or less. Was going to take my children and my $2.30 and start somewhere else." "I know," he said. "And you did this ridiculous, generous, impossible thing," she said. "It seemed like the right thing to do," he said, which was the same thing he had said on the bench outside the general store on the afternoon he gave her back the deed, and which still had the same quality of simple, undecorated truth. She turned her head to look at him, his profile in the late light, the familiar and beloved line of his face, and she thought about what Walt had said about ready being a thing you decide rather than a thing that happens to you, and she thought about the promise she had made Thomas about going on living, and she thought about how sometimes the thing that looks like the end of everything is actually the narrow door that everything else comes through. "Thank you," she said, "for the deed, for September 14th, for Thomas James and his opinions, for reading to me and teaching Henry to lasso, for fixing the barn, for all of it." He turned to look at her, and she saw in his eyes the same thing she had seen since that first evening at the supper table, that particular quality of attention that meant she was the most real thing in his world. "Clara Calloway," he said, with the weight of a man who is fully aware of what he has and is grateful for it every day, "you have given me far more than I gave you." She thought about arguing with this, because she was, as established, a woman with opinions. But instead she leaned her head back against his shoulder and looked out at the grazing field where the spring grass was coming up green and generous, and at Henry in the yard with his lasso, and at me on the porch turning a page, and at the baby on his father's knee slowly discovering the uses of his own hands, and at the limestone house that Thomas had built and she had kept and Rafe had helped her keep, and at the cottonwood on the north end of the property where the headstone stood in the evening light, and at the creek in the distance catching the last of the sun, and the whole of it was hers, fully and permanently and lovingly hers, which was the thing she had been afraid she would never again be able to say. 2 years later, in the summer of 1882, the homestead had grown in ways that felt organic and right rather than forced. The cattle herd had expanded to 60 head, managed between the home acreage and the 2 leased parcels east of the ridge, and Rafe had hired a hand named Carlos, a young man from South Texas who was steady and skilled, and who ate supper with the family on Fridays and played guitar on the porch afterwards, which Henry found mesmerizing and me found culturally significant in a way she couldn't quite articulate but intended to. The garden had expanded too. Clara had added a second kitchen garden along the west wall of the house and a small orchard of peach and apple trees, young still, barely past the sapling stage, but planted with the patient confidence of someone who understood that some things take time and are worth the wait. Me was 12 now, serious and bright, and developing into the kind of person who would one day be formidable in any arena she chose to occupy, which was a thought that made both Clara and Rafe simultaneously proud and faintly apprehensive for the world. She had a correspondence going with a girl in Amarillo whose father was a lawyer, a pen friendship that had begun through the school and had grown into something me clearly valued, and the letters that went back and forth contained, Clara suspected, the particular kind of frank and sophisticated conversation that 12-year-old girls have with each other and with no one else. Henry was 9 and had grown into a boy who was physical and capable and kind in the unself-conscious way of children who have been loved properly, and who could throw a lasso with genuine accuracy, a skill he demonstrated at every opportunity, and which had made him something of a legend at the Dusty Creek School. Thomas James, 2.5, was the kind of small child who makes everyone around them simultaneously exhausted and delighted. He had indeed developed opinions, as me had predicted, and expressed them on all subjects with remarkable clarity for someone whose sentences were still occasionally abstract. He adored his father with the totalizing love of a small boy, following him everywhere, and trying to do everything Rafe did, including fixing fences, which at age 2 consisted mainly of carrying a single tool from one place to another with tremendous seriousness. He was also, when the mood took him, given to breaking into spontaneous and tuneless song, which Clara had told Rafe was absolutely his fault. On a warm evening in June of 1882, the entire family was on the porch in the last of the evening light. Carlos had gone back to the bunkhouse. Walt had been for Sunday dinner and had ridden home. The children were at various stages of the winding down of the day. Thomas James half asleep in Rafe's lap with his thumb in his mouth. Henry sitting on the porch steps watching the first stars appear with the focused attention of a boy cataloging everything. Me reading the last few pages of a book with the determined expression of someone who intends to finish before bed. Clara had a letter on her knee from the county agricultural office in Amarillo. An inquiry about whether the Calloway operation might be interested in a cooperative arrangement with 2 neighboring homesteads for joint water management and shared grazing infrastructure. It was the kind of letter that would have been addressed to the man of the property a few years ago. It was addressed to C. Calloway, which stood for both of them. She had read it twice and was pleased with it. She put it down and looked at her family on the porch of the house she had built with Thomas and kept through loss and been given back by the man beside her. And she thought about the morning she had walked into the land office and put a piece of paper on Sela's drum's counter and said she needed to sell quickly. She thought about the price on that paper. Below what the land was worth, below what any of this was worth, below what she had been worth in that moment, though she had not known it. She had been giving it away because she thought that was what the situation required, because she thought there was no other choice. There had been another choice. It had walked into Drum's land office the same morning she had, and it had bought the thing she was selling and given it straight back to her. She reached over and took Rafe's free hand, the one that wasn't holding the sleeping boy, and she laced her fingers through his, and she felt the familiar, beloved solidity of him, the anchor of him, the way his hand felt like home, the same way the house and the land and the garden and the creek and the cottonwood all felt like home. "I've been thinking we should plant more trees," she said, "along the north fence." He said because after 3 years of marriage he generally knew which direction her thoughts were moving. "Along the north fence," she agreed, "and maybe down the ridge road, something to look at when you're coming home." "I like what I already see when I'm coming home," he said. She smiled without looking at him because some responses are for looking at the horizon. "More trees," she said, "and then maybe a second structure at the far end of the east pasture for when the cattle operation's large enough to need a second hand sleeping on the property." "Carlos would appreciate that," Rafe said. "Carlos and whoever he eventually brings home," Clara said, "because he has opinions about a girl in Lerdo that he thinks he's keeping to himself." "How do you know about that?" Rafe said. "Because I pay attention," Clara said, which was the simplest and most accurate explanation. Henry turned from his star watching on the porch steps and said, "Mama, what's that star there, the bright one?" "That's Venus," Clara said. "It's not a star, actually, it's a planet." "Why does it look like a star?" "Because it's very bright and very far away. Things that are bright and far away often look simpler than they are." Henry considered this. Like Mr. Devlin thought the water rights were simple. Rafe made a sound that was definitely a laugh he was suppressing. In a manner of speaking, Clara said. Me looked up from her book. Finished it, she announced. Was it good? Rafe asked. It was wonderful, me said. The ending was perfect. I like it when things end the way they should. So do I, Clara said. Me looked at her mother with the direct, clear gaze she had inherited from her, and said, with 8-year-old solemnity and 12-year-old precision, "Think we have a good story here, Mama." Clara looked at the house and the land and the evening light and the sleeping boy and the man beside her with his hand in hers, and the girl with her book and the boy counting stars, and the peach trees beginning their slow, patient work of growing, and the creek catching the last of the sun, and the cottonwood standing where it had always stood. "We do," she said. "We have a very good story." The stars came out one by one over the Texas panhandle, the way they did every night, indifferent to what happened below them, but somehow, in their abundance and their steadiness, like a benediction. The nighthawks started calling. Thomas James shifted in his sleep and made a small, contented sound. Me closed her book with the satisfying finality of a completed thing. Henry said the name of each star as he identified it, a private catalogue of the sky. Rafe looked over at Clara in the dark, and she met his eyes, and there was everything between them that 4 years had made. The grief and the gratitude and the work and the laughter and the children and the land and the ordinary, extraordinary dailiness of a life built together on solid ground. And none of it needed to be said, because it was simply present in the look, in the hands still clasped together in the warm dark of a June evening in 1882. Clara Calloway, whose name had been on a deed that was briefly sold and immediately given back to her, who had sat on a bench with $2.30, and a heart that was breaking and a spine that was not, who had kept a promise to a good man who asked her to go on living, looked out at the land that was hers, and the family that was hers, and the life that was beyond anything she had known to hope for in the dark, cold days of early spring 4 years ago. She kept thinking about that strange arithmetic of things given away and given back, how she had tried to sell her home for pennies and been handed back something worth more than any deed could say, how the land itself had never really been what was at stake, how what a person builds with their hands and their will and their love is the real thing, the thing that persists, the thing that a banknote can't touch as long as there is someone willing to stand up for the right of it. She looked at Rafe one more time in the dark. He was looking at the stars with the children, pointing out something Henry had missed, his voice low and steady and warm, and the sleeping boy on his knee breathed in and out in the deep, absolute peace of a child who has never had any reason to doubt that the world is a safe place. The Whitfield homestead, which was now the Calloway homestead, which would one day be the homestead of Thomas James and Henry, and whoever they chose and whatever they built, stood solid on the east ridge in the June dark, the limestone walls cool and thick, the garden fragrant, the creek running, the orchard beginning its slow becoming. And on the porch in the warm night, 2 people who had found each other by luck and by grace and by the simple, radical act of one of them deciding to do the right thing, sat together in the kind of peace that is not the absence of difficulty, but is the presence of what makes difficulty bearable, and the nighthawks called overhead, and the stars went on in their faithful abundance, and the land was theirs, and the life was theirs, and it was, in every way that mattered, exactly enough.